Chapter 21. Dread in the City. Notes. Many thanks for leaving kudos in comments. I love to read your thoughts as the story moves forward. I hope you like this one. TW. Child abuse. Chapter text. Chapter 21. Dread in the City. Khan was bored. After the numerous events that had happened during his break on Sereno, coming back to Towervin felt dull, numb, and uninteresting. Plus, he missed Anya. It had been a short month now since his return to school, cruising through his classes and training with the Shans. It wasn't unpleasant, but after dueling with Dooku nearly every day, trying a ton of new exciting things, and working with Anya on their personal projects, the return to his normal life was rather lackluster. He would meet with her in a month and a half en route to visit the Annabelle, and suggest further modifications if needed, and he spoke to her regularly on the comm, but it didn't feel nearly as fulfilling as waking up every day with her by his side. Khan stifled a groan at the thought, grossed by his own mushiness, and looked back at his datapad, purposely ignoring Zhang's mean looks. Something was brewing there. Zhang and Ailey seemed to have found a truce, and both looked awfully conspiratorial those last weeks, whispering in the corridors and meeting after class. He thought with a grin that they would make a fine couple of people to avoid, then saw an obvious correction to make to his latest KDY project. His little freelance initiative was starting to pick up enough traction that he had to work during his classes to satisfy the demands. KDY in particular had already hashed out an agreement for a permanent position starting right after his graduation, and he was negotiating the terms a bit more with each project he turned in. Mostly remote, not full-time, and atrociously well paid for a first position right after school. Human Resources contested his terms, but the head of the engineering department backed him, and he would probably sign soon, if he could get his hands on a test pilot seat in addition. The Chili Chinini restaurants were doing good as well, quietly laundering his money and getting quite a reputation for the quality of their exotic food, and Khan had sent directives earlier that month to his executive team to start encouraging a broader recruitment network that involved freed slaves, mostly from Tatooine at this point. Basically, discreetly smuggling people off planet. It felt good to recognize some names, to know that what he did was moving things, making them better. They were now implanted on several planets, multiplying exponentially thanks to Plagueis' dirty money, and they needed the additional workforce. As of now, the smuggling happened during supply runs for ingredients on the Dust Bowl, usually after the freed slaves had spent enough time laying low after their escape to avoid being noticed. Maybe, in time, the movement would grow enough to threaten the masters on Tatooine and other Hut-controlled planets. He knew some sent money home, working towards the freedom of the others, and that the slavers were slowly losing ground. One day, when the slaves would be able to stand for themselves, he would return and kill them all, especially Jabba. In the meantime, since mindless genocide was unfortunately not on the program of the Academy, he had to sit through his last semester of mostly tedious classes, before finally being able to leave the planet behind with a shiny diploma. He was going to miss some of it, he knew. The apartment, the sessions with Cassius, the temple, and in a way, even the Academy. But whereas he found comfort in his routine before, he now only felt limited, bridled by a boring day-to-day life. He didn't want necessarily more, but he wanted something different, and he was fine with sacrificing part of his current life to achieve it. There was one thing that nagged him though, one thing that his recurring sessions of therapy with Cassius and the love of Anya could not erase. A dark desire that stemmed from a particular evening in Dooku's citadel and would not leave him alone. Khan had a plan, he was prepared, and he was doing it tonight, in secret. Sighing in impatience, he sent the report back to KDY and closed his datapad. Dooku had been a surprise, overall, but a welcome one, and he didn't regret revealing part of himself to him. Rationally, it was safer for them that he knew of his power. The man had to know that if he told anything to Sidious, the vicious Sith would soon seek to replace him, foiling his plans. Dooku wanted to acquire power, but was being denied the knowledge he needed to do so by his master, if he interpreted the situation correctly. He felt a lot less dark than he had when he had met him on Geonosis the first time around, a lot less submissive too. He was still very much a ruler and a clever man, if an easily frustrated one. He hadn't given his soul to Sidious, not yet. If he understood what Khan had shown him, he never would. Anya had taken the reveal a lot less calmly than he did. Her anxiety had already been high before that. The upcoming end of their holidays had turned her insecure, overwhelmed, and scared, and it had spiked dramatically once the older man had left the room. She was afraid fate would repeat itself. She was afraid of them being jailed, tortured, made slaves again, slaves of Palpatine. She was afraid that when the time would come, he wouldn't stay by her side. She was afraid of being alone again. Khan had sworn again to protect her against that fate, and tried to comfort her, to tell her that this time they knew nothing of her gifts, that Dooku promised not to tell, and, even if it was a bit of a low blow, that she was the one who trusted him first. It hadn't worked very well, and he could still tell even now that she wasn't entirely at peace with Dooku's new awareness. In the discretion of his own mind, far, far away from Anya's awareness, he had taken a decision though. If Dooku stepped out of line again, he would not hold back that time, he would kill him. The farce he had pulled during their fight had been disgraceful already, a complete lack of respect. Any repetition of that kind of idiocy and he would made Anya the ruler of Sereno. She had been the only thing that kept him from doing just that morning, and she was still her uncle's only protection. He wondered if Dooku knew it. He probably did. The old man was cunning, underneath all the small talk. Khan liked him, he had realized. After spending the break with him, he found a certain appreciation for the former GD, perhaps even respect, maybe something like kinship. He understood his struggles, enjoyed training with him, and they had some interesting discussions. It was, however, not enough to sway his heart, not anymore. If the time came to slit Dooku's throat, his hands would be steady. Khan was still pondering on all of that when he boarded his ship a few hours later and plugged in the coordinates for Thyrsus. Who was he? What was his purpose? Was he always supposed to be a murderer? It seemed his life, no matter how nice it started, always ended up in blood. Each time he had someone to protect, he had resorted to murder. Was it destiny? The so-called dark side? Or was he just broken in a way that would never be salvageable, even with decades of therapy? Cassius had been worried, he had felt it. He had been happy at first, when he told him he had worked on both of his challenges, and had spent a pleasant holiday, but it had faded quickly, once he had realized how disturbed all of it made him. Triggered, wrong, sick. He had asked him if he had written anything on his table during the break, and if he had applied the techniques they worked on together. He had, but only partially, and most of his writings related self-hatred, unworthiness, and guilt. He had told the truth to the Ikwani, that he had been genuinely happy, and that it was the scariest thing he had ever experienced. The therapist had looked at him with compassionate eyes and asked him to develop. It had been a verbal hemorrhage. Khan had blurted out everything. How undeserving he felt, knowing he had such a potential for evil. How fast it all went, how he hadn't realized how overwhelmed he had been until Anya had confessed similar feelings. How he had been and still was convinced he was going to hurt her, how it made him feel like the worst person in the galaxy, because he hadn't been able to stop anything in spite of it. He had told Cassius he was a coward, a pathetic excuse for a romantic partner, and that she deserved so much better than broken, inadequate Khan. She had suffered, and he had been unable to prevent it. He was going to hurt her, and he felt unable to prevent it. He was powerless, he was a bad person, a hypocrite, a liar. He thought he was taking advantage of her feelings for him, pushing her into something she might not want, if she knew what he was trying to hide. Cassius had listened. It had been the least agreeable session he had so far, and after two others discussing his tangled feelings, he still felt rattled, raw, and deeply unsettled. It had cemented his desire to do something to regain some power over the situation. He needed to do something to preserve his happiness, at least for now. He couldn't sit still, and risk that Palpatine figured something out and rob him again of what he treasured. It hadn't been Cassius's advice, who had recommended rest, a comfortable routine, and treating himself as kindly as he could in this tough phase, but he was tired of listening, he needed to act. He landed in a small spaceport, the only one on Thyrsus, and let his senses expand, searching for a very specific force presence, one he hadn't felt for a couple of years now, but that he remembered very well. Khan smiled, predatory, perhaps a tad unhinged, and unloaded his speeder before heading towards his destination, a remote house in the outskirts of the main town, about 30 clicks away from the spaceport. He parked a few minutes before arriving at his destination, leaving the speeder in front of a relatively packed cantina, and did the rest of his trip on foot, steps light and discreet, face hidden by Ray-Van's mask and covered by his hood. He had his Sith blade on the belt Dooku had gifted him, his chocolate one safely kept on the ship, just in case, and the vambraces that Anya embroidered for him were on his arms. They felt warm, like the objects had been treated with so much love that it showed even now, and he knew they had been. Focusing on his task, he crept up the back of his target's house, positioning himself near a window so he could get a view, the force wrapped around him like a dark cloak, hiding his presence in the world. The house was worn down, the window cheap plastic instead of the usual transparent steel. They were poor. It was early evening on Thyrsus and the middle of the night on Talarvin. He listened. They were eating, at the moment, the father, tall and unforgiving, and the son, silent and meek. The father's voice was clear, cold, and piercing, admonishing his son for his weakness during training. He needed to do better, he needed to be perfect, he would never be enough otherwise. They had plans. He didn't mention who had plans, but Khan knew, and those plans stopped tonight. The father drank, afterwards, he knew because he heard him order the boy to serve him whiskey. The smell couldn't reach him, but the bottle the kid brought was unmarked, and he could tell it was the artisanal, cheap kind. A poor man, cruel and violent, shaping his son to become exactly as he had been. The kid went to bed after receiving a rough slap on the cheeks for spilling a bit of the alcohol on the floor. The man asked him to lick it, the child did, and his tears mixed in with the whiskey. Khan felt a pang of something sharp and painful in his chest, jaw clenched as he watched the scene. It looked domestic, usual, and it made it 10 times worse. How much of the behavior he knew the boy was going to exhibit was nature, and how much was nurture? He looked to be around 12, just a few years older than Anakin was, and he felt miserable in the Force. His throat swelled, and he suddenly felt very out of place on Thyrsus. He came here to satisfy an impulsion, a need to prevent the future from happening, but the beaten child that he could hear sobbing in his bed had done nothing yet, and wouldn't for nearly 2 decades. The Force wept quietly, sad for her youngling, and filled his heart with silent melancholy. Making a choice, he stayed at the window, waiting until the father was inebriated enough, then for the perfect opportunity to strike. There, letting the dark power trickle out of him, invisible and airy, the deadliest of smoke, he ensnared the father and choked him softly, triggering his gag reflex. He retched and Khan relaxed the pressure just enough for him to vomit, but blocked his mouth from opening. The man struggled, limbs flailing in order to get free, but what needed to happen happened, and he breathed in his puke, the acid and alcohol entering his lungs. Khan pressed harder, preventing him from spitting anything he was choking on, and in a few minutes, the man stopped moving, dead. He heard a soft patter and saw the child appear near the staircase, his wide eyes trained on the pathetic dead form of his father. He didn't scream, kneeling next to the adult and pushing his shoulder lightly, trying to see if he was waking up. When he realized the man would never open his eyes again, he sat next to the body, his face hidden in between his knees, and cried. There was sadness in the Force, but relief too, a lot of it, and Khan decided to leave him to it. The kid looked upright as he moved and saw his mask reflected on the window. Khan cursed under his breath but kept going, leaving his viewpoint at the window to go back to the street, moving as discreetly as he could. Stop. He turned and his mask met the snotty face of the recently orphaned CommanderRak, eyes furious and lower lip trembling. You did it, don't you? You killed my father. Khan had decided to let him live, to give him the chance to become something else, someone else, but if he forced his hand he would have to kill him. Stepping closer to the kid, he pointed his finger at him in a way that reminded him too much of Vader for his own comfort. Careful, child, or you'll join him in the grave, he told him, the vocoder distorting his voice into something much more threatening. The kid's jaw clenched, eyes burning with determination. Then I'll die a warrior, avenging my clan. He had forgotten how close to the Mandalorian values the members of the Sun Guard were. His sigh wasn't picked up by the voice modifier installed on the mask, and he gritted his teeth as the child launched himself at him, armed with a kitchen knife he probably slept with, to deter his father from coming to see him at night. Pitiful. He threw him on the ground, once, twice, but the kid didn't give up and kept coming at him, the dark side fueled by his anger starting to help him fight. Khan gave up his tight control when his annoyance got the better of him. He let his own power filled him and choked Karner with the Force. The boy gasped, feet kicking the air, trying to regain his footing, to fight back, but Khan was too strong. He gasped, his throat gargling ominously as his face turned red, mouth open, hands on his neck, scratching uselessly at his own skin. His neck bore purple marks when Khan realized that he was killing him and snapped out of it. He had left him alive, but barely. Disgusted with himself, he tried to run back to his speeder, hands trembling, heart beating too fast, but collapsed after only a few meters, his legs failing him. He fell on the dusty road, random rocks scraping his mask, and his heart collapsed in his chest, making him gasp in pain. He was having a panic attack, wasn't he? None of the techniques Cassius had taught him were working, and he realized he didn't want them to. He wanted to suffer, he felt wrong, even more wrong than before. CommanderRak at that time was a miserable child with an abusive father, still innocent, still able to do good with his life. And he had nearly killed him like one killed a fly, annoyed at its proximity. He couldn't leave him like that, in the dirt of the street, alone, unconscious, and defenseless. He had to do something. He had to do something. Khan stumbled on his feet gracelessly, his gloves and outfit covered in dirt, saw his vambraces and heaved, an icy hand clenching around his entrails. He wanted to puke, but couldn't in the mask. He shouldn't be wearing them, he wasn't worthy of them, he had just proved it. It felt like a betrayal. Where was his grandiose speech about doing what was right over what was needed, and finding other solutions? Why couldn't he do that himself? Why was he so weak? He ran back to the small body, tears gathering at the corner of his eyes. He looked dead already, and Khan could see the scrapes from their spar, but also the older, nastier bruises and cuts that marred his skin. Swallowing sour saliva, he picked up the boy and carried him inside of the house, not even looking at the father's corpse, and climbed the stairs slowly to the child's room. It was sparse, just a cot and a small light, and when he moved the pillow stained by Karner's earlier tears, he found another knife and a small collection of worn-out toys. The icy hand tightened inside of him, each beat of his heart painful and desperate, and he cried. He put the boy on the bed, arranging his dark hair matted by sweat on his forehead, his fingers trailing lightly over the bruises, over his sin. He reached through the Force, searching for guidance, for answers, for anything that would help to save the kid, and found a choice, and a sacrifice. The common theme it seemed. How ironic. Gritting his teeth, he reached deeper, further, feeling his dragon brush against the sleeping, wounded wolf cub, all tiny sharp teeth and empty belly. He wrapped his wings around him, the only part of him that made him stand apart from the other greater crate dragons, and pulled the wolf cub closer, against his chest, sharing that part of his strength that could right the wrong. They both gasped and the child woke up, eyes wild, trashing against his hands. He held him still, watching his neck, unblemished, his vanished dark circles, and the newfound glow of his skin. Carter stopped, at some point, eyes glassy, his presence subdued. He was expecting abuse, Khan realized, and was starting to dissociate from reality. "I'm not going to hurt you. Not again." He didn't relax, and Khan didn't expect him to. He had heard the words a couple of times before, in his early youth, uttered by scums that were only deterred once they realized he was already someone's property. He wouldn't have relaxed either. Insulting himself from the confines of his mind, he decided to use the couple of minutes he still had, while the child was still somewhat receptive, and made up the biggest lie he had ever told anyone since a pretty criffing long time. "You have the Force, like me. I felt you, and I came to find you. I saw what he was doing to you, I couldn't let him hurt my kind. Are you going to take me?" The kid whimpered, curled as far from him as he could be. Khan shook his head, then realized that with the black and red mask on the gesture was probably not as friendly as he would have wanted it to be. "Not if you don't want to, but you will need training, at some point, training they can't give you here. Others will seek you out, too, others like the one making plans with your father." "The master? Why would you want me?" Carter averted his eyes, and he was hit by a wave of shameful sadness. "I'm weak, I'm useless." "You're not," and they both knew it. "Once he'll realize that your father is dead, he'll send for you, offer you everything you think you want, and enslave you just as he did with him." He looked terrified, and Khan felt bad for him, but underneath it the Force beamed, elated by his actions, and pushed him towards his path, righting the wrong, setting the tracks for something brighter, better. Maybe the kid could feel it too, or maybe it was just his nature, but after a few seconds of reflection, he met his eyes again, that same flame of determination alive again. "I don't want to be a slave. I don't want to stay here. I can take you to our kind, but it won't be an easy road either. A GD's mission is to make the galaxy a little better, one action at a time. It requires discipline, strength, and there are no fast rewards," he preached, guilt spreading in his veins, stronger with each word. Oh, how far he was from being this perfect being he was describing. Carter huffed. "Better than to roll at the feet of the master." "Then come." Carter picked up his toys and put them in the pillowcase, before robbing the kitchen of the meager amount of food left over. He emptied the spot where his father kept the credits and put everything in his makeshift bag. He followed him to the speeder, then to the ship, and they flew towards the stars, leaving the dreary planet behind. It felt right, so right, but his rational mind was screaming at him in pure terror. This was so much of a risk, so much more than he bargained for. He had come to Thyrsus to kill the boy, to make sure he would not hurt Anya in this timeline, and instead he had gained a stowaway who looked at him with hidden curiosity, and had already asked for two, less lethal, demonstration of set force. He seemed delighted when he managed to make his pillowcase float after some explanation, and the smile of pure joy on his face convinced Khan he was somehow doing the right thing. They spoke a bit of the different temples, and he ended up dropping him in Coronav City, on Corellia. He gave him the GD Enclave's directions, and the boy nodded, much calmer now. He could see the layout of the amazing soldier he had been later on in his life. He would make a great GD, they would help him heal, build a life for himself. Possibly. They stood on the ramp of the ship now, and neither seemed to want to be the first one to speak. "I wouldn't hold a grudge, you know, for killing father and choking me. So he wasn't going to gain a 12-year-old mortal enemy. Neat. That's very nice of you. Thank you for taking me out of there. I won't forget you," Carter said in a voice he clearly wanted to be steady, but clearly was not. "I won't forget you either. May the Force be with you, kid. And with you." He stepped out, casting a last glance at his near-killer and savior, then turned back and left, his pillowcase the only thing he carried. Khan watched him for a while, still not quite sure of what he had just done, then started the ship and departed, programming a jump back to Talarvin. With all of his traveling, it was the beginning of the second day of the weekend now, and by the time he would be home, the sun would have started to set on his home planet. Once in hyperspace, he removed the mask, hiding it back in the secret compartment where he kept his lightsabers, and sighed. Righting a wrong had been much more efficient than any of Cassis's techniques, surprisingly, but he still felt rather exhausted from the endeavor, both emotionally and physically, since he had never explored any healing abilities before. Crumbling on the sleeping cot, which still was covered by Anya's duvet from their Korriban adventures, he enjoyed the moment of pure calm, lulled by the noise of the engines and the glow of hyperspace. With his return would come the second part of his sacrifice. He would have to figure out a way to tell Anya of his deed. Anya gazed with mild disinterest at the human singer that was reaching an incredibly high note on stage, a few floors below her, and wondered if she would have the time to review the bill that would be presented the next day before going to sleep. It was some sort of tricky amendment to the existing Act on Public Health that allowed specific specialties of medical practices to overrun their fees. At first read nothing particularly alarming, but she was concerned it would restrain the access to healthcare and encourage malpractices, like performing useless tests and treatments to increase benefits. On the other hand, in certain systems where medical practices were struggling with the Republic's conventional reimbursement system, being able to adjust their prices themselves on at least some of the care provided would help to maintain a proper medical presence and guaranteeing access to basic healthcare. It was pushed by a senator she didn't know personally, so her vote had little ties. Most of the party would vote in favor of the bill, but the campaign had been lukewarm, and she expected the next day's vote to be tied. If she had been drafting it, she would have specified the maximum amount of overrun compared to the conventional fee, or maybe link the overrun authorization to the medical coverage of the system, to limit the system drifts. Could she argue for the bill to be reworked? Anya made a mental note to read through it again, and prepare a short speech if needed, then focused again on the singer. She was in Valorum's private viewing balcony, sipping pricey sparkling wine, as she listened distantly to the Chancellor, and bemoaning Antilles made what they thought to be very educated jokes on Senator Mina Bonteri's stay-at-home husband. To her ears, it was rather crude, really. She was enjoying the evening, misogynist jokes aside, the singer was great, the appetizers amazing, the wine fresh and bubbly, and Valorum's praise appreciated. He had followed the advice she had given him before Life Day, which to her felt like ages ago, and distanced himself from his family's companies, including the one that was the most at risk, the shipping and transport business on Iriadu. He had snubbed her as she had expected when the Senate meetings resumed, thinking her advice over the top and foolish. Once she had finally been able to secure a meeting with him, the man had been a nervous mess, and told her in disguised words that he had only followed her tip as a precaution, and to not overstep her role's boundaries. However, a week ago he had been the target of more corruption rumors, and his removal from the board of this company had been the only thing standing between him and a full-blown investigation, and since then Anya was back in his close circle of trusted favorites. She let it go, she needed to stay in his entourage for her plans to work, but she would not forget his unpleasant behavior. He had involved Antilles too, asking him to audit his portfolio of assets privately to help him decide what was safe to be involved with and what needed to go. The cleansing had drained his funding infinitesimally and restored a solid front for his detractors. Antilles himself had been reassured of his chancellor's goodwill, and their relationship was at an all-time high. She toyed fondly with her necklace, thanking Khan mentally for pushing her to send that holomail, and repressed a slight frown when bemoaning Antilles called her out on it. Gorgeous necklace, my wife would love if I got her something similar for her birthday. Where did you get it? She smiled, proud that he noticed the beauty of it, and heard Valorum's hum of approval, appraising the ornament. I can recommend some stores, Senator Antilles, but this one was made for me by a very close friend. Antilles gave her a suggestive smile that made her want to gag. When an ardent pursuit of your heart, I would presume. A dedicated suitor, most would not have the skills, nor the will. Indeed. Valorum clicked his tongue, interrupting Antilles' next question. Leave Countess Anya alone, Bale. Us old men should let the youth have fun in peace. They both laughed as Anya smiled, amused. If she was fully honest with herself, she wasn't on particularly warm terms with Khan at the moment, and their last interactions had been far from fun, but the alcohol helped her put their fights aside and enjoy her evening, and she wasn't going to ruin her happy moment now. Later that night, long after the opera was over, once her public attire was removed, her bill reviewed, her speech written, and her body plunged in a soothing bath with glittery chandelier salts that bubbled pleasantly around her, she allowed her mask to crack and reveal a tired face and sad eyes. Like most times when she was at odds with Khan because of something he did, she felt like she understood him, and that hurt even more because she couldn't really blame him for acting as he did. She could, maybe, blame his initial intentions, though the twisted chivalry in them was not unappreciated, but not the results. She would have preferred to stay blind to his reasoning this time. It would have made resenting him a lot less painful. Khan had wanted to apologize, at first. He had confessed, shameful and guilty, uneasy under her gaze, and waited for his sentence. He knew he had done something wrong, he understood his rash actions could have been disastrous for their plans, and that acting behind her back would not be received well. The tone of their discussion had shifted rather quickly afterward, and things had turned ugly. Why? She asked, feeling the tension between them rise after her prolonged silence. Why would you do that? I wanted to protect you. He replied defensively. I need you, not an attack dog. For force's sake, Khan, what would have happened if you'd killed him? She shouted back, eyes tearing up already. What would have happened, Anya? He asked, his voice dangerously calm. Do you still love him? Anya couldn't answer, she would not. Tears came, flowing freely on her cheeks, and she averted her eyes, unable to meet his. I trusted you, she whispered. She didn't want to remember what they had hurled at each other afterward, it was not worth it. They had wanted to hurt each other with their words, to win. There was nothing glorious about any of it. Anya took a sharp breath and noticed her quickened pulse and the slight tremor in her hands. Forcing her mind to quiet, she slipped under the water and plunged in the Force, looking for variations to distract herself from her hurt feelings. The familiar knots and strings floated around her, mostly still. She reached for the bond by reflex, and warmth spread in her chest, as the now familiar feeling of love and elation bubbled along the thick thread. It was tainted these days, resentment and jealousy fraying its edges, but the core of it was still the most comforting thing she had ever felt. Moving away reluctantly, she inspected the others, checking for any undue changes, any newfound aggressivity, but she found none. If anything, the Force felt more at peace than before, more light too. He had broken a cycle that made the Force sad, righted it wrong. The rational thought didn't warm her heart. Anya needed to see, she needed to feel it, to make it real, to verify by herself. She didn't trust him, she realized. If he had done something like that, why wouldn't he lie to cover his tracks? He had to know she would be mad, maybe he had tried to mitigate a reaction. She reached out to the present she knew so well, looking for his string among the others, and found it, small and gray, tiny knots glittering silver when her own light came closer. She touched it tentatively, and felt Khan's energy still attached to it, purring in contentment when hers rubbed against it. It made her stomach lurch uneasily. This was so messed up. The string twisted, reaching out to her in return instinctively, and before she could avoid it, she got flashes of scenes, impressions. The tall man screaming, pain, humiliation, the feeling of being useless, never good enough, not being able to sleep at night, in fear of what could happen if he let his guard down, ever. Then another tall man, with a black and red mask, the tall man dead, and a new home, warm, better, magical. Anya broke the contact harshly and retreated, shame spreading in her veins at her perverse curiosity. She pulled her head out of the water and took a deep, shaky breath. Her cheeks were wet from her immersion, and she had no idea if she had cried or not. It was not going to make any of it okay, ever, and she would lie if she said a part of her didn't tense at the idea that he had spent any length of time with CommanderRak, but from what she saw, Khan did what was needed. It would be easier on her sanity, though, if each time they were separated he didn't act on random whims, and turned their perfectly designed plans into dumpster fires. He would have made a fine Padawan for Qui-Gon, she thought sarcastically, so keen on following the living Force and disregarding everything else. She heard a comm unit ring next to the tub, and, recognizing the frequency, picked up. He was the last person she wanted to talk to at that very moment, but she never refused his comms. What if it was vital? What if something went wrong? She had to know at least what he wanted before hanging up on him. Khan's holo appeared and he quickly took in the wet hair and half-cut image. "Are you in the bath?" he asked, voice laced with disbelief. Well, it wasn't like she would have picked up for everyone, and from that angle, he could saw nothing anyway. "What if I was?" she replied with a raised brow and a sliver of anger. He didn't take the bait. "I felt you in the Force." Anya frowned, annoyed. "I was looking for disturbances. Did you find anything?" His tone was neutral, but she could feel another argument brewing already. Force, she was tired of arguing with him. Did it even matter what she found? What was done, and he clearly hadn't stopped to consider what Anya, or the Force, would feel about his actions at the time. "You pleased?" as she finally replied, her lassitude obvious. "You cured a wound in the Force. It feels more at peace than it ever was since our arrival." He looked pleased, and she had to admit that on a logical level, she was too, but the admission felt sour in her mouth. The Force was fine, sure, whatever. It didn't mean that she wasn't still aggravated with him. It had even occurred to him that some things were not to be touched. She had confided in him because she had wanted to do it, because she trusted him. Using that knowledge behind her back to track her future past rapists was just not acceptable. Carter was her problem. She didn't need Khan to go all-night mode when the kid hadn't done anything yet, and her feelings for him were complicated enough without adding this in. If Khan had killed him, as he had apparently intended to, she wasn't sure she would have been able to forgive him. He hadn't, thankfully, but when she had told him he had turned against her rather harshly, his apology for their first fight quickly devolving into a much less palatable discussion. He had said mean things again, things she knew he regretted uttering. He was jealous. He didn't understand that she did not want Carter dead. If he had hurt her that much, surely she couldn't be happy that he was alive. She hadn't been cruel enough to tell him there was a difference between wanting a person to disappear from her life and exacting murder like some sort of self-righteous vengeful god. There was nothing to be gained from returning his anger. Anya had kept her mouth shut and listened and cried. He had tried to apologize again afterward, but she hadn't wanted to hear it, not anymore. It was hard though. She loved him, she hated the fights and the pain and the anger, she wanted it to stop, but she was afraid if she let this one go, he would repeat the pattern. With what she saw though, well, if he saw it happened under his own eyes, she couldn't exactly blame him for being a decent human to Carter, could she? She just wished he could have extended the courtesy to her. Why would he go on Thyrsus hunting for blood in the first place? Did he really think that killing a 12-year-old boy for what he was perhaps going to do was going to make her happy? Or safer? That it would protect her? It wasn't what she had in mind when they came back. They were not supposed to become judges and executors for people who hadn't done anything yet. She had thought. She had thought he understood, after what he told her on Sereno, but she had either been wrong, or he had some sort of relapse, and just acted impulsively on it without thinking about the consequences. He had learned about a threat, his instincts had kicked in, and he had planned to take the threat out. Anya bit the inside of her cheek. She didn't like that train of thoughts. It tasted like death, like war, like Sidious. The only silver lining outside of the Force being satisfied with Connor's improved living conditions was that despite feeling him hurt by the distance she had put between them when she had learned the truth, she also felt him somewhat liberated, lighter. His good deed had created some peace for him, much needed peace. But for him, it certainly hadn't for her. Whatever. She wanted to believe that perhaps his good deed meant that CommanderRak would never do to others what his future self had done to her, and even if they could not be sure, the possibility was too enticing for her not to agree, albeit reluctantly, with his redemption quest. She forgave him, but she would not forget. "What have you been up to?" she asked despite her previous wish to keep the discussion short. He beamed at her, and she couldn't find the strength to hold her grudge any longer. It was the first real conversation, and not just a lame update ending up in an argument, that they had since their first big fight, 3 weeks ago, and she missed him. Mainly that summoning project, and some freelance work. "I started working on the Vambraces too, I want to add a flamethrower." "Boys." She discreetly rolled her eyes and twisted her body to face him, her neck starting to cramp from being turned in his direction. "Do you want to wait until we can find some time to do the summon, or will you perform it on your own?" He shook his head, looking resolute. "I have to do it alone. I already have the object to center the connection, and with your notes on rituals, I think I'll be able to do it. I don't want to involve you in this one. Too many unknowns." Anya gritted her teeth, but she knew firsthand how intimate rituals could get, and she didn't want to fight with him. "Not again. Not so soon. Let me know when you plan on doing it, so I know when to be worried if I don't hear back from you," she replied somewhat acidly. "Before Kuwait, for sure. Probably next weekend. On Talorvin." He dismissed her with a shrug and changed the topic, visibly not inclined to discuss the summon. "I'll cast a circle. What have you been doing? Rumor has it you're replacing me with dear old Valor." Eating calorie-free ice cream and crying over their fights while working herself to death. She was very much not going to tell him though. "Lobbying for Feng to become vice-chancellor. The election is in 3 days. Do you think he is going to make it?" She hummed in assent. "Yes. Ameta is still strong competition, of course, but Talorvin has done a lot in the past year to connect with the Outer Rim, and help the less favored, and it's been noticed. Under your suggestions." My discreet suggestion, she corrected with a smile, pleased that he recognized it. Feng was a great senator, but he had certainly benefited from the countless opportunities she had created for his planet and himself. "Of course, Your Excellency," he replied teasingly. She laughed and felt her exhaustion retreat for a moment. Twirling a piece of wet hair around her finger, she leaned a bit more on the bathtub rim, and saw that the blue hollow of his face got a little darker. Good. There was something endearing about how easily she could get him flushed, a sort of bashful awkwardness she guessed stemmed from how he had been raised. After their stay on Sereno, Anya herself wasn't particularly shy around him anymore. After all, there wasn't a single corner of her body he hadn't seen, but somehow, even if he was usually the one taking the lead there, she could still make him stutter with the smallest display of flesh. "The Serenian Orchestra will play on Talorvin in 2 months. The Talorvinian one came last week," she told him. She had known about it for a while, but her original plan had been to keep it for herself, and having Khan learn of her presence on his planet via the holonet. Petty, undignified, and she would have punished herself just as much as him. Khan frowned. "Will you be there?" Anya felt her throat tightened in anguish, and had to remind herself that it was not a big deal to ask him. If he said no, she would take it gracefully, and move on. She had already picked an outfit for him too, just in case, but that was before their fight. Maybe he wouldn't want to go, maybe he wouldn't want to see her. She had intended to ask him to go with her to that concert during the call, where he had confessed about the Karna thing. She had been so excited at the mere idea of going with him, but the conversation hadn't gone according to plan. Feng went to Sereno, so I figured it was appropriate for me to come too. I told him I would plan my stay myself this time. "Will you come with me?" she finally asked hesitantly. "To the concert?" "Yes." He did not reply, and Anya frowned at his silence, her anxiety rising as her fear came true. He didn't want to go. He didn't want to see her. She raked her memories to try and find why he would be adverse on this type of outing, but found nothing. It was her. He didn't want to see her. After all, after his official appearance on Sereno, their relationship was no longer a secret for anyone who knew what to look for on the holonet, and he hadn't seemed to regret it. He was still mad at her for the fight then, and he didn't want to see her. He saw her pained face and answered her silent question. "My last time at the opera was unpleasant." "Oh? Palpatine." She could work with that. It was a lot better than the idea she entertained before. "Then I will have to make sure to rectify that, if you're willing," she teased, still a touch unsure. "I will go," Khan replied, and she knew he would keep his words. A leaf flooded her veins, leaving her a tad breathless as she met his gaze. "Thank you, Con." She shivered. The water was getting cold now, and there was something in his eyes that unnerved her. A glint of something settled, committed. It felt like more than just trust, and she understood instinctively that forgiving him had linked them even tighter. She swallowed, throat tight once again, and got out, wrapping a towel around herself. When she turned, she saw that he had politely averted his eyes. Smiling internally, she took the comm unit with her and passed by the kitchen to grab a glass of Jogan juice before going to her room. She put the device on the bed and a glass on her bedside table, before starting to look for sleepwear. Con raised a brow, having watched without a word her little strut around the apartment. "Do you want me to leave you?" "Not particularly, it's been a while since we spoke. Anything new at school?" He snorted, amused by her antics, and she saw him move from the sofa he was occupying to his bed, lying down against the pillows to make himself comfortable. "I believe Elise and Jang are conspiring against me, though I have no idea what they have in mind." Anya finally found the nightgown she had been looking for and put it on, dropping the towel on the ground. "You could." When she turned back towards the device, his eyes took in the silky short dress by reflex before snapping back to her face. He looked like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "Cute. At this point, I'd rather be surprised. There are only 4 months left before graduation, and I'm hardly entertained these days," he drawled after a few seconds of silence. "It was that girl at the spaceport, right? The one that wants you. The bitch that looked like a wannabe Amidala and felt like a complete lie in the Force." Anya remembered her a lot better than what she was pretending to, and her first impression of her hadn't been a great one. "And the mean boy from this summer, who tried to get us in trouble and started the rumors." He nodded, looking a tad amused by the descriptions and the animosity he could hear in her voice. "Yes." Anya settled on her bed, careful to position herself in a flattering angle. She had an epiphany, then. Khan raised a brow. "Care to explain?" "It'll spoil your fun," she replied with a small, atrocious wink that thankfully didn't seem to displease him. "I'll find something else." She sipped her juice, careful not to spill any on the sheets, and marveled at the idea that in a few months they could have those conversations every day if they wanted to. She would be able to hear the vibration in his chest as he spoke, to feel his warm torso against her head and his hands against her. As busy as she was, she had to admit she hardly felt entertained either, these days, with her bed always cold and his presence so far away from hers. She missed him. Focusing on their discussion again, she replied. "When I met her, she understood that her chances for romance were limited, as long as I decided to stay with you, and allied with the one she knows as your only enemy. They're going to try and drag you in the dirt, the boy because he hates you, the girl, so that I end things with you, and hurt you enough to make you vulnerable to her." His gaze sharpened, something tightening his expression. Insecurity maybe. If he thought she was going to dump him because of high school rumors, he was sorely mistaken. "Are you?" "No," she asserted. "When you agreed to appear at the parade, I implicitly agreed to be by your side, no matter what slander those peasants will spread about you." "No matter what they say?" he asked, his uncertainty now obvious. "I'm sure we told each other way worse things about ourselves than whatever they will come up with." And she had just decided to forgive him for something far more damaging than the stupid gossip wannabe Amidala was going to brew, but it felt wrong to remind him of it right now. She faked pensiveness while she buried the unkind thoughts and pursued. Knowing the mean one and his complete lack of class, it will be something perverted, and considering the girl's goals, something that would make you undateable. Khan relaxed slightly. "Any bets?" "I'm oddly interested now. From what I remember, the boy was rather obsessed with your humble origins. Probably something that makes me look like a cover, or make you look like a gold digger, both, if they manage to find something credible." "Did you do anything that could make you pass for a male escort outside of dating me?" "The meeting with Sandhill, then, if they managed to dig that up." What the criff had he done with Sandhill that could warrant that? Oh, they had met in a hotel, hadn't they? People had such a wild imagination. "Do you think he will mind?" He shrugged. "He'll probably find it somewhat amusing. For a sadistic banker, he is not without humor." "Does he like music?" Khan's eyes narrowed at her in suspicion, and she couldn't repress a smile. This would definitely be scandalous, if her hypothesis was the right one, but would for sure provide at least some entertainment for him. If it got back to Coruscant, and she was quite sure it would, this would also be a great way to distract the press from Valorum. The Chancellor was a nervous wreck and really needed a break at this point. Plus she really didn't like either of the Talorvinians, weak-minded fools with petty hearts, and not 1 ounce of honor, and felt some mean joy in the idea of turning their own game into her ploy. If they hurt Khan though, even a tiny bit, she would destroy them with no remorse. He realized what she had in mind, and his eyes widened. "You want to invite him to the concert? I have an entire balcony lodge, and you like him, right?" she asked innocently, knowing full well he could perfectly tell she had ulterior motives. "He is better than I expected, yes, and we do exchange regularly, but that wouldn't justify his presence on Talorvin again. That's for him to worry about. Worst case scenario, he'll just say no, and if needed I can definitely make myself available for a business meeting." He is sponsoring the Galactic Flight Academy, and we've been discussing increasing his participation in the scholarships. Khan frowned. You know him? Through official wholemeals. I'm only interacting directly with him because Uncle Yan is his ally. He sighed, falsely bored, but she could feel how interested he was. Well, let's have a scandal, then. I'll send the invite tomorrow, and tell you what he answers. They shared a conniving smile, and not for the first time since they started talking, Anya regretted not being in the same room as he was. It would have been so nice to kiss him, right at that moment, or even just to snuggle close to him, and to breathe in his comforting scent. It would have put a physical end to their argument, a conclusion of sorts. She was quite sure they wouldn't have argued half as much if they had been together in person. Tentatively, she reached out with the force and saw him startle when he felt her presence brush against his. He reached back, the same feelings she sensed earlier rushing back with great strength, making her feel lightheaded and stupidly happy. The bond vibrated, twirls of smoke and bright platinum expanding around them, glittering like the night sky. It settled, surrounding her fully, and she heard distant whispers, the wind howling softly in the dunes, and the quiet noises of the forest meshing together. Anya let herself dive deeper into it, and it felt nearly tangible, like he was here and she was there and they were together again. He came closer, and she could feel his heartbeat, his warm breath against her skin, his soft hair under her hands. Deeper, again, and she couldn't tell if she was still on her bed on Coruscant or on his bed on Talarvin. She felt his hands on her back and lightly traced his jaw, marveling at the very real feeling of it all. He kissed her, his lips smooth and pliant against hers, and she felt something tremble between them as unabashed pleasure and searing desire coursed her veins, making her yearn for more. The kiss deepened, leaving her breathless and burning for him. After a few fairly enjoyable minutes though, she started to feel lightheaded again. Slightly disappointed, she broke off the kiss and relaxed against him, closing her eyes and enjoying his embrace. It felt like an apology, and she took it as such. They must either have fallen asleep like this or she passed out from exhaustion, because when she woke up her comm unit was dead, she had a killer headache, and her nose was red from blood. Qui-Gon Jinn had always been a firm believer in following the living force, even against the Jedi Council, and despite every trouble it had ever caused him. It had guided him over the years, helping him overcoming hardships and finding truths, both galactic ones and his own. But these past months, the Force felt unsure, clouded, and Qui-Gon was growing concerned. He still had no explanation for that presence he had felt now a couple of times on Coruscant. Cypher Diaz, forever plagued by his visions, was becoming more and more erratic and increasingly absent from the temple, and one of his friends from the Green Jedi Enclave, Nehe Helsing, had contacted him recently to tell an interesting tale of a man in a mask, bringing to Corellia a rather traumatized youngling. Something was brewing in the background, and he could tell that there was some sort of connection between the events, without being able to find out what it was. He had shared his doubts with Yoda again and again, but the Master, frustrating as he could sometimes be, just advised him to keep meditating on them, and to listen to the Force. Sometimes he truly wished his master had stayed with the Order. Dooku would have been a much more involved listener, and his bright mind would have been a blessing to sort out this mixture of feelings, impressions, and random facts. He couldn't go to him, though, not this time. Dooku was on Sereno at the moment, not on Coruscant, and there was something in their last discussions that rubbed him wrong. He had doubts, perhaps unfounded, that Dooku was toying with the dark side, and that he might be involved in the series of events that disturbed him. If that was the case, it would be unwise to discuss it with him. Qui-Gon dismissed his rising disappointment in the Force and thought of Anya. He hadn't seen her since the winter break, and she had spent 2 full weeks with her uncle. She would know if something had happened. Could she have insights into both situations? He looked distractedly on the news feed that passed on the hollow of Dex's dinner, commenting on the surprising ascension of Senator Feng Di Selenia to the position of Vice-Chancellor of the Republic, one of her ploys, probably. His jaw clenched in determination. He sent her a message asking if she was available to meet him, and returned to his musings while he waited for Dex to come and see him. "What can I do for you, my friend?" the cook finally asked after instructing his waitress to take his place in the kitchen for a minute. "I was wondering if you have heard anything from the underground. A new player, perhaps." Dex scratched his chin with his upper right arm, pensive, and sat down in front of him. When his eyes met Qui-Gon's, his look was somber, his mouth pinched in a displeased manner. "The syndicates have been more active, murders are more frequent now, not that anyone particularly cares about the victims." Qui-Gon felt something tremble in the Force at his words and frowned. "What do you mean?" The basilisk made a vague gesture with his arms. "Thugs, little gangsters, some bounty hunters, not one of them will be missed. Do you think someone is cleaning up?" Dex shook his head. "I'd say someone is making room. This doesn't smell like vigilante work to me." "Worrisome. Any idea who?" "None." Dex leaned forward, looking apprehensive. "Whoever did this, they've been careful about covering their tracks." "I'll look into it, thank you Dex. Please let me know if you hear anything more." The cook sighed. "Be careful, Qui-Gon." "I will." He paid and left, pondering on his friend's words. Could the dark presence he had felt be the one responsible for killing the criminals Dex spoke about? It was likely. There was too much overlap for it to be purely coincidental. Probably not the one who delivered the youngling though. He doubted the dark presence he had felt would be the type to bring a youngling to a GD temple. According to Nehe, the boy had qualified the man as his savior, a passing GD who had felt his suffering and decided to intervene. He couldn't know at the time that no GD would kill outside of a life or death situation. A rogue maybe. He rejected the tenets and decided to go on his own quest. Still, Qui-Gon had trouble imagining even a former knight resorting to such practices. Whoever that person was, they were certainly not a true GD, even if they had enough knowledge of the different temples to help the kid choose where he wanted to go. A worrying thought too, if maybe less of an immediate threat than the Coruscanti one. His comm unit rang with Anya's reply. She was at the opening of an exposition presenting indigenous art from currently endangered planets. The Sir was organizing to raise funds for their relief efforts, and invited him to come. He sighed at the idea of having to rub elbows with the rich and powerful, but took his speeder to the coordinates she had sent him. The sun had just set on Coruscant, and rays of purple light still glittered on the glass buildings when he arrived. The event was held in an indoor greenhouse, and he was offered a drink specially created for it, as well as a flimsy booklet detailing the history of each piece upon entrance. The receptionist droids greeting him warmly, telling him that Her Excellency would be available after her speech, and inviting him to enjoy the exhibition. Going with the flow, as he tended to do, he walked through the phosphorescent blue path that led to each piece, beautifully displayed in glass cases with appropriate lighting in the midst of the exotic plants, tall trees, and chirping birds that usually populated the greenhouse. Orbs of blue lights were floating peacefully, casting a soft glow on the plants. A little scene had been erected in the middle of it, a holoprojector transmitting the speaker's speech at different places around the course of the exhibit. Anya was speaking at that moment, dressed in an elegant velvety dark green dress with her hair down, and held back by a simple gold tiara. He had missed most of her speech, apparently, but caught the end of it. If you purchase a piece of art from this exhibition, you are not only purchasing a unique creation, you are purchasing a piece of history, a piece of culture, and you are actively working on safeguarding dozens of others. As inhabitants of the core, we often forget about the treasures abounding in the outer rim, and how important it is to preserve those planets and their ways of living. This evening in the wonderful scenery created by the Sir, we are offered a chance to remember how rich our galaxy really is, and I invite you to enjoy this opportunity to its fullest. On that note, I will leave the world to Dr. Alan Sale, specialist of foreign cultures and researcher at the Academy of Arts and History of Coruscant, who will explain in details each piece, from the techniques used to create them to how they embody the culture of the planet they are from. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sale. She stepped out of the stage and applauded warmly the man who took her place before retreating in the background, as he started explaining a complex tapestry from Chilgana, representing a fight between two Nexus in a forest scenery. Qui-Gon was actually listening quite intently when he felt her approach. He was always curious about the world, and took quite an interest in the dyeing process of each strand of the artwork from different wood barks, and how they incorporated arboreal ectopi fur to give texture to the piece. She gestured towards the exhibition and smiled at him. I supposed you wouldn't mind this type of event. How are you, Qui-Gon? He smiled back, lulled by her smooth voice and the kind light she emitted in the Force, sharp at the edges, but soft overall. They started walking off the blue path, following one of the trails that weaved around the groves and trees at a slow pace, as the warm, slightly humid atmosphere made his tight shoulders relax slightly. It is nice to see the Senate working for charitable causes. Anya smiled. Isn't it? She politely ignored her unanswered question and cast him a pointed glance, brows furrowed in concern. Something is on your mind. Strange events are taking place, he replied vaguely. Connected? I suspect, though it is tough to see how. Anya hummed, eyes narrowed, and touched the necklace shining above her collarbones. A beautiful piece, the jewels echoing her eyes, hair, and the tone of her skin quite nicely. The gift, if he had to guess, and a treasured one. The GD from Towervin, probably, though it looked a bit expensive for a student's life day budget. Someone was making a statement. If I were a GD, I would suggest you wait for the Force to bring you answers, but I guess that is not what you are looking for, she finally said, her expression strangely distant. The Force is clouded on this matter. Something glinted in her eyes, too quickly hidden for him to pinpoint exactly what. You should look for who benefits from all of them. Do you know something? He asked carefully, understanding he was treading on shaky grounds. As he predicted, her face darkened as her shoulders went stiff, the sharpness in her signature growing sharper still, carving the air around her in agitation. You think my uncle has something to do with your problem? Perceptive and clever. Admirable qualities, but it didn't really work in his favor here. I've seen him change, these last few months. Coruscant did him no good, I'm afraid. There was an edge behind her words, and he added it to his ever-growing list of strange occurrences. Whatever plagued Dooku, she suggested it stemmed from here. Sifo Diaz was avoiding Coruscant as much as he could these days. He only came when strongly encouraged to by the council, gave his report, tried to make them listen to his pleas, then fled again. Qui-Gon had felt a dark presence on Coruscant a couple of times. Someone in the underground of the planet was creating a power vacuum by removing criminals from the scene. Was there a dark sider at play on Coruscant? Trying to turn Dooku to his cause, hiding in the shadows right under the GD Council's nose. If he excluded the Corellian outlier, the conclusion made sense. Too much sense. Their eyes met, his mouth open to pursue his line of questions, but she cut him off before he could ask. I do not want to know. He is the only close family I have left. It doesn't mean you have to support his every action, he retorted, trying to keep his voice soft to prevent the discussion from escalating. True. There was ice in her tone, loyalty as well. Even if she knew something, which she most certainly did, she would not betray Dooku. Sighing softly as they kept walking around the greenhouse, faces illuminated by the soft orbs of blue light floating around, he decided to change topics. He would not get anything out of her anyway, and he didn't want to antagonize Anu. Tight-lipped or not, he considered her a friend, and from what he knew she had nothing to do with the chain of events that plagued his mind these days. Congratulations on Vice-Chancellor De Salini's election. She smiled again, visibly pleased to see him extend the olive branch, and her face lit up with satisfaction. Thank you, Qui-Gon. I'm confident Fang will strengthen the Senate considerably in his new position. What should I expect to see in the news in the coming weeks? She smiled, a touch mischievous. A scandal, if my instincts don't fail me. Her eyes were full of mirth, enjoying a secret joke she didn't want to share with him just yet. He raised a brow, intrigued, but she waved her hand dismissively. I'm sure you'll recognize it when you see it. Hopefully, it will take some light away from our poor Chancellor. He has been a constant target these last few months. Another clue or just a remark? He glanced at her, curious, but she just produced a half-shrug that was probably wildly breaking the etiquette code a countess had to follow at all time and change topics. He filed the comment for further inspection later on, and followed her in a new discussion, without commenting on the brutal change of subject. How's my favorite Padawan? She asked, her amusement already leaking in the Force. I'm sure he misses you, but overall dear Obi-Wan has been faring quite well. He will not be a Padawan for much longer at this speed, Qui-Gon told her proudly. Anya smiled, a genuine one. He'll make a splendid knight, I'm sure. Will you teach again, or try for the council? We'll see when the time comes, he replied laconically. He had no wish to seat on the council, preferring to challenge it from the side and keep his freedom, but those were internal matters and none of Anya's business. They kept chatting a little while, trading light jokes and avoiding any serious topics. Then Anya was called back to the stage for the auction, and bid him goodbye with a gentle smile. Qui-Gon took his speeder back to the temple, and took some time in his shared space with Obi-Wan, to water his rather large collection of plants, before heading to his room. The discussion left him with more questions, but the Force felt substantially clearer now, like he had been given important keys to understanding the situation. The picture it painted was not exactly to his liking, though. He was about to go to sleep when Obi-Wan knocked on his door. He signaled his assent and the door slid open, the light from their living area illuminating Obi-Wan's face, contorted in worry. He gestured for him to come in and sat upon his bed, concerned by his Padawan's distress, then saw that Obi-Wan's hands were trembling slightly as he approached. I'm sorry to disturb you, Master, I just thought you should know, his Padawan said shakily, visibly disturbed. Qui-Gon put a calming hand on his shoulder. Did something happen, Obi-Wan? Master Diaz is dead. He had been sent on Felucia to quell a conflict and perished in battle. Something felt not right about that statement. It reeked of half-truths, and Qui-Gon's blood turned to ice in his veins when his mind automatically arranged Sifo Dyer's death, with the terrible impression he had the last time he saw him, and the rest of the information he had learned from Dex and Anya. The Chancellor undermined, Anya pushing for someone else than Ameta, arguing Valorum needed more strength, the underground silently altered by an unknown player and someone on Coruscant preying on Dooku's doubts. Sifo had been his best friend, and had spent months trying to convince the council they needed to prepare for war, being slowly cast out, and now meeting an unexpected end in a conflict that was little more than a skirmish after a last, desperate attempt to make the council move. If he classified the death as intentional murder, then it meant that whoever wanted to weaken the Senate and gain control of the syndicates, also wanted to keep the GD Council unprepared for whatever he planned, and to convince Dooku to act rashly. Sifo had been right, someone was planning a war.